I was 12 years old. My parents had asked my 15-year-old brother and me to remain at the dinner table a bit longer that night. They said they had something to tell us. I'm not sure where my 9-year-old sister was, maybe at a friend's sleepover somewhere in the small North Carolina town we lived in at the time. My dad said, "I have good news and bad news." My brother and I listened intently. "The bad news," he said, "is that I have lost my job. The good news is I have a new job with the same company." I remember looking at my mom, and I could tell by her face that more news was coming. "The new job," he said, however, is in Akron, Ohio. So when school lets out for the summer, we will be moving. As I recall, my brother instantly burst from the table, tore down the hallway, and slammed the door of his bedroom as loudly as he could. I remained seated and dissolved into a puddle of tears. Through my sobs, I heard my dad sigh and say to my mom, "Well, that didn't go so well, did it?" Big transitions were ahead for my family, but in my 12-year-old brain, mostly all I could think about was how these changes were going to impact me. I was at that age where friend groups expand across genders, where deeper connections start to happen. My friend group was tight, and I was panicked, wondering what it would be like to move to a new town just before I started middle school. Things weren't supposed to go like this. The whole thing was a disaster, at least at first. But as all of us eventually have to play with the cards we have been dealt, I made peace with the change. There wasn't much I could do about it anyway. As the moving date neared, I decided I needed to mark the occasion in a formal way. And so I wrote a 2-page letter to the dozen or so friends I knew the most, the ones I assumed I would have grown up with, gone to high school with, maybe even to college with, the friends I had thought that I would know for the rest of my life. I put a lot of effort into that letter, carefully taking the time to acknowledge how important these friends had been in my life up to that point, how grateful I had been for their friendship. I think I even cried some as I wrote it. What can I say? I was a sentimental 12-year-old. I rode my bike to the local post office to make photocopies of the letter, and at the bottom of each one, I wrote a personal note of thanks. Then, a few days before we moved, I put the letters into the mail. I think back fondly to this rite of passage that I created for myself, even as I wasn't sure how my letter would be received. I figured my friends might think I was being weird to go to so much trouble, to make my departure so dramatic. But I knew my intentions were good, and I didn't care if my friends thought I was weird. I needed to say thank you, and I will miss you, and so I did. That story came to mind this week as I've been thinking about you and how you and I will need to soon say goodbye, how big changes are ahead for us, and how we might best mark and honor these transitions. And incidentally, because I hadn't thought about this letter in a long time, I have one friend from that time period that I rediscovered on Facebook a year or two ago. So I sent her a message. "Hey, do you remember this long letter that I sent when I moved?" And she said she did. I thought that was amazing. And she said that what it brought for her was empathy for me, that she could see things through my eyes, how weird it would be to leave. It was just a really good exchange, and we talked about 6th grade memories. It was awesome. It really was. As I moved from my friends in North Carolina, I knew that I was saying goodbye to an era of my life. I knew that our friendships would not continue, not really, not in a substantive way. How could they? I'd be hundreds of miles away, and we would no longer share the school experiences that had bound us together. We were facing a kind of death of what had been so that our futures could arrive, and we had no choice but to accept it. You and I will soon say goodbye to an era in our lives as minister and congregation. Some of you I have known for 16 years. 16 years. Some of you are more recent relationships for me, but no less meaningful. And during our time together, I've been grateful for my connections with you and for our shared ministry. More grateful than you can know, truly. And after we share our final service together on June 11th, our connections will not end exactly, but they will be different in significant ways. They will not continue as they have up to now, that's for sure. How could they? I will no longer be your minister. And that is how it must be. During my internship at the Unitarian Church of Evanston, as I was learning the complexities of what it means to be a congregational minister, I remember sharing dinner with a thoughtful member named Brian. He was a great guy. I always enjoyed our conversations. He asked me how I felt about the possibility of a minister being friends with members of the congregation beyond just the relationship of clergy to layperson. He said that the current ministers of the church, my supervisors, had told him that ministers could never really be friends with church members, and he thought that was crazy. He wanted to know my thoughts. I told him I wasn't sure how I felt about it all, being new to the ministry, but I did know that I trusted my supervisors and would follow their lead until I had good reason to do otherwise. He was not satisfied with that answer, but he said that he honored that I was being politically savvy, he said, by not veering from the counsel of my mentors. It took me another year or so to really grasp why ministers can't really be friends with members, not in the way we typically think of friendships anyway. I mean, clearly ministers are friendly with members of the congregation they serve, at least the ones who keep their jobs are. Right? They can't possibly navigate their ministries well if they aren't. And yet, there is something about the relationship of minister to congregant that is inherently different than a friendship. And that difference is about responsibility to and for the office of the ministry, whether we like it or not. It was during that address that Reverend Mark Morrison Reed gave to colleagues the year before I was ordained that I began to really understand this. I can tell you, sitting there among my 1,000 or so colleagues that June afternoon in the year 2000, hearing that speech was like walking through a door of no return for me. I became fully converted to his perspective that there are 3 sentences that should be in the fine print of what it means to be a congregational minister. These are his 3 sentences, and they are, you will love your parishioners with all your heart, but never befriend them. You will pour out your lifeblood for the community, but never settle there. And you shall die to the congregation so that the ministry might live. Now, in my mind, it was that last sentence that really explained the first 2, and that was the most important of his presentation. You shall die to the congregation so that the ministry might live. In his address, Morrison Reed referenced a famous essay written nearly 40 years ago now by one of our colleagues about how to end a relationship with a congregation, how to die to the congregation so that the ministry might live. In that essay called Running Through the Thistles, the author, Roy Oswald, wrote of growing up in rural Saskatchewan and of how, as a young boy, the quickest way for he and his brothers to get home from school was over the fields through enormous thistle patches. Rather than take the long and safe way around, they would often choose to sprint through the thistles even when they didn't wear shoes to school. He writes, I can still vividly remember the experience running full speed in bare feet across 20 feet of prickly thistles, yelping in pain all the way through. Morrison Reed shares Oswald's belief that this story is, in fact, symbolic of how many ministers manage or mismanage departures from their congregations. And I would say how many of us handle the difficult goodbyes of our lives. As he describes it, we deal with our farewells by steeling ourselves, then plunging in. We know it's going to hurt, so we rush full tilt ahead, hoping to just get it over with. At the end, he says, there may be a few thistles stuck in our feet, but our ordeal is over, or so we think. But rushing the goodbye is not ultimately helpful, nor is trying to pretend that the goodbye isn't coming or isn't necessary. One of the benefits of 16 years in ministry with you is that I have been witness to many final goodbyes. People leaving the congregation, people leaving this life. Some have been rushed, Some have been so hidden as to be nearly non-existent, but some have been so intentional and grace-filled that I couldn't help but be inspired. I'm thinking about member Jane Bibber, how in her final weeks, as she knew she was dying, she embodied a blend of traffic cop, orchestra conductor, and virtuoso musician. She directed the traffic in and out of her room, asking for people when she needed them, telling them to leave when she didn't. She brought out the best in those who visited, charming them to play along with her. And she took her time to craft her final melodies with the intention of reminding those she cared for why she cared. She savored her time in the spotlight of her death, knowing it was her time to shine. She was radiant the whole way. Similarly, Zenda Lindell was also in charge of how she said goodbye to us a few years back, at least for as long as she could be. She gathered around her friends that just a few years earlier she wasn't even sure that she had, and then she loved us up, even as she never relinquished her salty self. She was large and in charge throughout, even agreeing to a living memorial celebration service that served as a model for similar ceremonies we have held here for other uniquely strong women as they neared their final goodbyes. Ruth Ann Harstead, Cynthia Lee. All of these folks, and many more, lived in their final weeks the 5 tasks that Oswald says are essential to saying goodbye well. These 5 things that are important for us in all our important goodbyes. They are: be honest about why we are leaving, take control of the situation the best that we can, get our affairs in order, let go of old grudges, and say thank you. Now, as I think about my departure, my upcoming departure from you, I think I've done okay so far in my attempts to fulfill these 5 tasks with you. I've been honest about why I'm leaving. I've tried to follow through on some of the things that are still undone in our shared ministry, aware that there could never be a time when all things would be complete, and also aware that my job as I conclude my ministry with you is not to become the interim minister or make some last-ditch dramatic efforts to fix everything anyway. I'm grateful that I don't have lingering grudges with you, but if I did, I would definitely be trying to make things right, as I hope you will do with me. And while I'm not sure I will ever have enough time to say thank you the way that I want, I'm grateful I still have a few more weeks to try. But there is one task that we have remaining in order for me to die to this congregation so that the ministry might live. We have to prepare for and understand the best that we can that when I step away from my ministry with you, I must truly step away. I will not be attending services or events here, at least not for 3 years, if at all. The first 2 years of the stepping away is so that the interim minister can do their work with you without the interference of my presence. The 3rd year is for the next senior minister to become settled with you, also free of my presence, for similar reasons. And then, if I wish to participate in the congregation, I will need to work up a covenant, an agreement with the senior minister that outlines the relationship I will have with this church and with the ministry going forward. My professional covenant as a minister requires that I be respectful to the ministries of my future colleagues who will serve here, and I intend to honor that covenant in all ways. That means, this is hard for me to say, but I have to say it, that means I will not be available to officiate memorial services or to conduct weddings here without the explicit invitation of the senior minister. I will not entertain conversations with members or staff of this church about congregational politics or decisions or pastoral care needs. I truly must step away. Now, some of you may already be at peace with this. You've experienced ministerial transitions here before. And some of you may be even anxious for me to leave. You don't have to tell me who you are. But this stepping away can be difficult for ministers like me, and for some members too, because it may seem like an abandonment of everything that we had previously shared. And it's not that. It's not. But I will say that we ministers during this transition, we lose our identities that came with the role. And some members may feel with the departure of the minister that they have lost their church. And these tensions sometimes lead departing ministers and remaining members to try to keep these connections alive to avoid the pain of letting go. While clinging to the previous connections is understandable, it's not healthy for the church nor for its ministry. Since first telling you of my impending departure back in December, I've been hesitant to bring up this stepping away with you, because we've both had enough to grapple with just in imagining that I would be leaving in June. And I know it may be disappointing or confusing to some of you to think of me truly stepping away, much like it was for Brian, that fellow from my internship congregation who thought it was crazy that our relationship couldn't continue. But there are good reasons for stepping away. The next ministers who serve here, along with Reverend Aaron, deserve the opportunity, the privilege, the blessing to develop the connections with you that I have had the privilege to enjoy. I know what I forgot, Bill. Kleenex. They will need to be the ones you turn to for rites of passage, for pastoral care, for spiritual guidance. And they need to develop these connections without my intentional or unintentional interference. It's true, I will be staying in Des Moines, and we will see each other, and I will be happy to see you, whether in my role at the ACLU of Iowa or as one of your neighbors and fellow citizens. I will see you, and we don't have to hide from one another. Not at all. But we do need to be clear that my service as your minister will conclude on June 11th. And the role of minister will then continue to belong to Aaron and to the ministers who will follow me. Some have asked me what my family will do once I step away, where they will go to church, where I will go to church, and so on. And I'm not exactly sure. One of the gifts of my ministry with you, though, has been developing my understanding that while I am a Unitarian Universalist through and through, I believe I can find and make meaning in other religious traditions. If I discover that I need religious community once I step away, I trust I will find one that will work well enough without interfering with the ministry happening here. That said, my daughter Leah may choose to stay involved with you, and if she does, I know you will welcome her, and I thank you for that. When I heard Mark Morrison Reed's Berry Street essay nearly 17 years ago, I knew that my fate was sealed, and I'm grateful for the advanced warning. I knew that one day I would need to step away from this congregation and from its ministry. Challenging though it is, this transition is not exactly new to me, not really. I've been preparing for more than 16 years and trying to minister to you while being respectful of it. I knew from the start that by accepting the call to serve you, I would love you with all of my heart, and I would pour out my lifeblood for this community, and I have. But I also knew that I could never fully befriend you, not in traditional friendship ways, nor could I permanently settle here. And I knew that I would eventually have to die to this congregation so that the ministry might live. Even so, I will be challenged by this goodbye. I look out at you on Sunday, and I know I will be challenged by this goodbye. We have shared too much. I've had the privilege of being intimately involved in some of the most important moments of your lives. You don't just let that go. It lives in you always. So, let's take these last few weeks together to say goodbye the very best that we can. Let's be honest about what will come for us after this departure, both the known and the unknown. Let's honor what we have shared and learned and loved together. Let's take control of the situation. Let's get our affairs in order. Let's let go of old grudges. And let's say thank you in all the ways we still can. I believe, I know, we have so much to be thankful for. So very much indeed.